Climate change is no longer operating at the margins of security analysis. It's beginning to alter the physical conditions in which military systems function, from the behavior of the oceans to the stability of infrastructure in the Arctic. And strategic stability depends on predictability. And these are not just distant or abstract changes, they're already impacting how submarines are detected, how early warning systems operate, and how reliable critical defense infrastructure remains over time. I'm Dominic Bowen, and welcome to the International Risk Podcast, where we explore the risks that are shaping our world and the forces that are driving global change. Our guest today is Dr. Florian Krampe. He's the Director of Studies for Peace and Development at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, where he also serves as the Director for the Climate Change and Risk Program. Dr. Florian, welcome back to the International Risk Podcast.
Yes, thanks for having me back.
Florian, were you still in Stockholm?
Yeah.
Fantastic. We should be recording this in person. I can't believe we're doing this in two different locations. But alas, I'm looking forward to the conversation today. I think there's a lot of great things we can unpack. We're seeing increasing evidence that environmental change really is directly impacting the physical systems on which defense and even deterrence rely. I understand that Arctic early warning is altering the ocean acoustics, which impacts critical infrastructure. And which is introducing just new forms of uncertainty into the strategic environment. Can you help us understand what is actually happening and what does that mean for us today?
Dominic, you're making the right point. I think we're making at the moment 21st century security decisions with 20th century assumptions about the world and the conflict theater as such. Let's just take a mental trip and think about Greenland. I mean, a lot of discussions at the beginning of the year around Greenland and with Trump making claims and threats towards Greenland and Denmark. But if we take ourselves into the northwest of Greenland, we'll find a faceted white dome over the frozen expanse. And it's assembled of triangular frameworks. It's a design or an engineering masterpiece to withstand the Arctic winds and harsh weathers dominating in these conditions. And this dome is crowning a fortress anchoring this remote outpost of human engineering against the sprawling snow-swept tundra. So this dome is not a random structure. It's part of these early warning radar stations that we see all across the Arctic. And because of the impacts that climate change is having on the environment in the Arctic, we see that some of the foundations of these early warning systems, which are fundamental for tracing Russian bombers and nuclear bombers, which are crucial to monitoring space, those are breaking down. We're changing the physical reality in the Arctic is changing. And for me, one picture that has really been important to visualize how this physical change is actually unfolding is if you think about it as chess. So in the 20th century, chess is about moving your pawn, moving your queen, moving your knight. It's about creating the strategic conditions on the chessboard to win a strategic battle. What is happening now is because of the impact, the physical changes that climate change is bringing to the Arctic, but also beyond, the pieces are still there, but we don't know which game we're playing anymore.
I understand that some of the early warning systems in Greenland, they really function a little bit like a lighthouse in a blizzard, where their role is to keep working when everything around us is really hostile. And I think in the current environment, and the Chinese president Xi Jinping made some really scary remarks when speaking to the leader of Spain recently about the international system crumbling. And I think at times like that, we really want to make sure our early warning systems are accurate and functioning. Now, I understand that the construction of roads and telecom towers and early warning domains in places like the Greenlands are built robustly, but should we be understanding that the impact of climate change means that some of these are less accurate, or their functionality might be impacted, or how should we be understanding the actual physical security of these items?
So a lot of those infrastructures are actually built during the Cold War. They're built on permafrost. And we see increasingly that the permafrost is melting. And just the physical conditions changing is having a severe impact on the infrastructure. So the radar early warning stations are one aspect where the foundations are impacted and where we need to do heavy investment to adapt and tune our military infrastructure to maintain its early warning function. But it's also impacting runways that are buckling under the changing conditions. And what I find specifically in 2021, the Russian Environment Ministry was estimating that approximately 40% of its Arctic infrastructure, and so not just military, but infrastructure at large, has suffered climate related damages. Now, if we see the impacts that we see on our side, on the military side, we barely have any information on what are the environmental impacts or the environmental climate related damages on Russian infrastructure in the high north, which Russia having a substantially longer Arctic coastline than any of the others.
And I wonder, Florian, if you can help us understand. I mean, because when we talk about Greenland today, sadly, all of us, the first thing we think about is Trump's comments to take over control of Greenland. Now, I understand that Greenland's environment, what you described, that harsh environment and the infrastructure that there, makes it strategically valuable, and that certainly sat at the front of missile warning and maritime routes and broader Arctic security. So I think that conversation made sense. And the arguments that the US and Denmark and others have made around national security and economic security, I think we all understand at least the what was stated. Is that in itself enough, or should we be considering, the fact that with climate change, it's now easier to access the minerals that perhaps countries are interested in, Denmark, and the cost of updating the systems. How should we be looking at the geopolitical comments about who controls Greenland today?
I think that is a really good question. And I think what a lot of us are puzzled by is what are the real intentions, or what were the real intentions behind Trump's statements and Trump's policies vis-a-vis Greenland. Some will argue it was about doing that it's about a reintroduction of the Monroe Doctrine of regional spheres of influence. So I'll be honest, I don't know what Donald Trump is thinking. I can see those factors are playing in, but a development of Greenland and access to critical minerals would be possible within the existing frameworks and within the existing agreement. So I have a hard time to believe that that is a pure necessity to do. But I think there is important dimensions beyond the Greenland example and how the infrastructures or beyond actually the infrastructural changes that we're seeing, because there are real operational challenges that are also really important to take into account. And that's not directly at the question that you were getting at, but I think it's a really important part if you look at the dynamics and how it's impacting anti-submarine warfare. So very, very important part of strategic stability. So strategic stability rests on the strategic stability between nuclear armed states rests on the confidence that both states have second strike capabilities that can survive a first strike, right? And this is a foundation of mutually assured destruction. And for this to function, nuclear armed states must be confident that their retaliatory systems work. So the early warning systems are part of that. The nuclear submarines are another part of that. They are notably placing nuclear weapons on submarines that can evade detection and survive a possible first strike. So it's a very important part of the nuclear triad. And what we're seeing because of the impact of climate change and the related inflow of fresh water through melting ice is that we're seeing direct impacts on the existing assumptions around how sound propagates. So it's actually really interesting to look at the physics there, and sound underwater bends, and it creates in the past or in normal conditions it reaches a thermal layer, and from that thermal layer some sound will bounce off and some will bounce in another angle, which creates a nice triangle at the side, which is a blind spot. So if you're hiding there, you're not being detected. So this assumption is changing. And I think that is a really important aspect and raises questions around not if submarines are harder or easier to detect. Both might be true. but there's a more epistemic problem in it when the oceanographic conditions are changing faster than our detection systems are adapting.
And so, what does that mean? I mean, the Arctic, we know that the Arctic is warming significantly faster than the global average, and the global average is alarming in itself. And, you started to talk about the consequences for the sea around, fresh water melting into seawater. You started to touch on the altering ocean dynamics and some of the acoustic environments, which are central to the submarine detection. But this, I don't know if we can say it's a degraded acoustic environment or an improved acoustic environment, but at least a different acoustic environment. What does that mean in practice? You talked about that ability to detect submarines. What does this mean in practice for naval operators and for our ability to deter and to identify if opposing forces are entering an area?
It raises the cost of adaptation. And they are always there. We always need to stay ahead. But the changes are so drastic on this chessboard being changing. Before it was more about actions, it was about technological advances. I think that is a fundamentally new dynamic that we need to take into account, where we need to have very very significant investments in the adaptation, right? And I mean, just to put that into context, if you look at the number that is potentially needed of investments. So the last Biden administration's 24 defense budget, the Biden administration in 24 requested 5.1 billion US dollars specifically for enhancing combat capabilities and mitigating climate risks. So part of that is improving or making the infrastructure more resilient. Part is adapting the systems and technologies to the changing environment. But we see this tremendous investment that is necessary and is really, really critical.
Yeah, I think that conversation about investments is an important one. We know that the US defense budget is just absolutely phenomenally large. I think it's in excess of $900 billion annually, by far the largest of any defense, and I think the following 10 countries combined. But when we look at the specific investments around different parts of the infrastructure, I think that's important. And you mentioned things like buckling runways, which of course I think sends a cold shiver down most people's spines who fly regularly. But runways, radar stations, early warning systems. How much of these systems already been degraded by global warming? Or is this something, because much of the global warming discussion, which is I think where we lose a lot of people, we're talking about in 2050 and 2060 and 2075, which means most of us can go, that's for my great grandkids to worry about. So when we talk about the investments needed today and the impact of melting permafrost, what does that actually mean for investments and the actual infrastructure that we have in place today?
No, I think that's exactly a really important point. And those changes I've been talking about now, those are changes we're seeing today. Right? Today we are seeing the impact on infrastructure. Today we're seeing the changes to the acoustic environment of the oceans. We're seeing that. Add on top the projections related to climate change. I mean, today a study came out anticipating that an amok collapse, so the Arctic circulation, which is really important for European stability of the weather, is increasing. So the likelihood of a collapse is increasing. It's going to change things drastically. But already today we're in an environment where we see that, and we're seeing that in terms of the infrastructure impacts, in terms of the operational impacts. But we're also seeing that internally already with natural hazards, with flooding events. Like think about Spain, think about Poland, and other cases in the last years, where we see a very significant impact already on our societies. Wildfires, tremendously important in the Nordics, in Canada, in the US. It's taking resources also from the military. We're both in Sweden. When we had that this year, you had a snowstorm, and you have Swedish military equipment being deployed to help save people. So it's a really important function that the military already has, specifically in the north, to aid in civilian crisis response. But we're going to see more of that. We're going to see much more of that, and we are going to need to adapt the military capabilities to this changing environment, because every deployment to aid with flood or fire rescue or wildfire deployments is going to degrade the equipment. It's going to interfere with training cycles. So it's distracting the military from its actual purpose and actual task that it primarily should be focused on. But if you think then about I mean, you quoted the numbers on our expenditure, and so if you look at the global military expenditure, which was 2.7 trillion globally in 2024, a record high, representing the steepest sustained increase since the Cold War. But still, while we know where we're having this heavy investment because of the geopolitical changes and the security situation we're living in, we're ignoring the climate dimension. So we're talking about 5% GDP targets for NATO. At the same time, if we take the European Central Bank's estimates, and which is suggesting that Europe needs to mobilize 2.7 to 3.7% of European GDP annually to reach the green transition and reach our targets. So the important part, and I think that we understand much better because of the events in the last 1.5 months, is that energy autonomy and the green transition is not necessarily about green. It's not about trees and bees and climate. It's also about hard security choices. It's going to increase our resilience against such systemic shocks like the closure of Hormuz.
And if we take that to, you started to talk about how, it impacts the military and the deployment of the military. I'm also wondering about how these changes actually impact the infrastructure related to our decision-making processes, and whether that's going to impact the reliability of our early warning systems, if that increases the chances of miscalculation if we have less reliable systems and submarines can slip through and potential nuclear weapons or weapons can be fired that might give off the wrong signature or a signature that we misinterpret. And of course, false alarms. Is there something around that we should be thinking about?
It's absolutely something we need to think about because I think those risks always are there. They might increase. One aspect, in addition to some of the technical elements that you mentioned, but one is because of, if you look again at the Arctic, because of the melting, increased accessibility of the Arctic for shipping and for activity because of melting ice, is the risk of accident is going to be increasing. So that's another factor that is really important to take into account. So with more traffic, civilian traffic in the high north, what are the implications of that? And there are other aspects where, to go back to that chessboard, where you might not know if that is a malicious action or if that is a climate impact or a more natural occurring impact. And I think that is going to have really serious consequences potentially that we need to take into account. So including environmental considerations into our frameworks and security frameworks, I think is really important, in addition to integrating that into our technological capabilities. But we need to find the governance frameworks and the mechanisms, especially at a time like this, where tensions are so high, and also the potential willingness to misunderstand each other is quite high.
That's something I'd really like to unpack, because the military tensions are high. The geopolitical tensions couldn't be really higher, and global military spending continues to rise. And I think the arguments for that, and the arguments against, I understand as well. But in this current environment, you can see why so many countries are spending on their military. Yet the spending, as you said, the spending on the environment has been relatively low and not meeting the targets that we know. And we know that climate risk and climate change is often treated as a secondary issue when compared to immediate threats and budgets and planning systems. But at a time when there is significant concern about the impacts of AI and on employment and social safety nets and healthcare and hospitals and the quality of our education from America right through to Europe and everywhere in between, you can see how the difficulty when you're a politician and you've got a pie that only makes up 100%, and yet you've got to give 5% to defense, and now the environment wants another 5%, and the hospitals need 15%, and education needs 10%. You can see why planning is so hard. What's what's the argument? What's the discussion that we should be having around how our budgets are split between defense and how our defense departments are spending money and how they're considering the impact on the environment of their spending and whether they buy uh, green tanks? And I don't mean the color green. What's the sort of discussions that should be had?
I think there's an important element to ask ourselves what security actually is and what we are actually securing. And we have been hosting a set of roundtables around the question of human security. What does human security mean in a time like this? And actually, in the Nordics, what does it mean in Sweden? What does it mean in Finland? What does it mean in Norway? And it was really interesting. It was really enlightening. And I think where we really need to get to is a more complex understanding of security. At the moment, we're seeing having a tendency, or generally, we're having a tendency to look at one thing at a time. And that luxury is gone. We can't. Yes, the security threat from Russia is a real one. We're seeing the drones flying through European airspace, and I mean that's accidents like that happen continuously. So there is a real threat. We're seeing the threats and discourse that is voiced against Europe from different actors. But at the same time, as I said before, all those climate change impacts and the security implications on our societies are also real. So we don't have a choice. We need to do those things at the same time. If we want to increase our security, you cannot do that without also looking at climate change because climate and environmental change is already degrading that security you're trying to build. So we need to bring those things together. We need to find new narratives within our societies to come to a wider, more comprehensive security perspective and lens that is bringing these different perspectives together. That is, yes, the hard security dimension is an important one, but the climate security one is an important one. And you mentioned the social welfare systems and things. Those are also fundamentally important systems in place that we need and are part and parcel of our security in our societies. It's about protecting our societies. And that encompasses all those factors that we need to take into account. And that is going to be involving trade offs. But I think if we change our mindset, it can also actually drive innovation and solutions. Where are our innovation drives to find important parts and parcels of the green transition, like synthetic fuels, battery systems, off-grid systems, water treatments, all these type of things? They're going to make us as a society more resilient because we're gonna create a better, more resilient environment. We are less dependent on fossil fuels. Will not increase climate change, but they will also make us more secure on a defense side because all those things and those dependencies on fossil fuels and logistics are also existing on the defense side. And in the long run, we need to drive those changes and those innovative solutions jointly and more aggressively, especially at a time like that, because we do not have the luxury to pick one, solve one, and then start looking at the other one.
Yeah, I think that's critically important. And at a time where we're seeing an increased number of conflicts, we're seeing many geopolitical experts actually asking the question, are we in World War III right now? I mean, it's frightening that academics and experts are even asking that question, but the amount of hybrid threats is increasing, that shifting geopolitical order that we've discussed. I think the prompting of that reassessment by SIPRI and the conversations that you and your colleagues are having is incredibly important. And I always love the concept of going back to human security. And from what I understand from the discussions that SIPRI's been having and with some of the Norwegians and the United Nations, the conversations around blind spots in current priorities and that weakness in trust and social cohesion and emerging biosecurity risks and the security implications of artificial intelligence. strangely enough, all topics we're discussing on the International Risk podcast, these are all things that are really, really important. So I wonder, Florian, when you think about the dialogue that you and your colleagues are having, what are some of the policy changes that you would like to see to create better human security? And at the same time, not walking away from what really is important, especially in Northern Europe, around that total defense.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an interesting observation, and you're absolutely right. There are a lot of colleagues at SIPRI that are looking very specifically at some of those dimensions very deeply and for a long time. I mean, we have been doing work on AI in the military domain for a really long time. We have been doing impacts of climate change or the environment or of war on the environment since the late 70s. So all of these type of things exist. What I think is a both encouraging thing, but also a dangerous reflection of the time we're living in, is that I'm actually having much more exchange with colleagues in the weapons of mass destruction program or on military expenditure than I had in the past. And that is a good thing because we need to, as I said, we need to get a better, more comprehensive lens. We need to have a better understanding of how things come together. But it's also a reflection of a reality where those things are connected, not because we want them to be connected. I'm always happy to go for a coffee and lunch with the colleagues, but actually because we see the necessity how things are gonna be impacted. And I think that's where we need to see the changes. We need to more research that is looking at this and showing us the evidence how those connections are and how they are unfolding. But we also need the political system to take those things seriously. And the political system is the one that tends to look at one thing at a time instead of having the more comprehensive, long lasting perspective on taking those things together and finding solutions. I am convinced that when we do that, as I said, the innovation part is, I think, so fundamentally, it's actually gonna make us more resilient and gonna have tremendous opportunities for our societies in the future.
And I wonder, the political discussions and the sensible discussions that need to be had. I know there was some Swedish politicians who were pushing for a transformation to solar powered and electric tanks, which right now don't exist. And as we speak, the Swedish research agency FOI has been tasked with coming up with a solution, which right now seems a little bit ridiculous about all the things we could be prioritizing. Solar powered tanks, I'm not sure that should be at the front of the queue, but hey, I'm not an expert on tanks and solar powered vehicles. How do we keep these conversations and conversations around early warning, about the equipment, about the maintenance of systems, and about the transformation of our militaries into modern militaries that meet the needs of our defense needs, but also meet the needs of our defense and environmental security? How do we make that a mature conversation? What are the things we need to be asking of our politicians and expecting from them?
I think those conversations, especially in some of the research institutions like the Swedish Defense Research Agency and others, are happening. But I think the point around, I haven't heard about solar tanks yet, actually. But of course, the electric powered tanks is always this weird concept that pops up, especially on the critique, like you want us to have electric tanks. I think there is a need to mature the discussion, and I think it's happening with a large part. I mean, as I said, the Biden administration asking for 5.1 billion US dollars for the adaptation and mitigation efforts to enhance combat capabilities. That is not because somebody I mean, that is stemming from an assessment that is happening internally. So those evidence-based assessments need to happen, and they are or were happening at the moment, especially in the US. They're very much under a lot of pressure. But I think we also need to find ways to look at, as you say, to look at it more maturely. As is the smartest way the electric tank? Sure. I mean, probably if we would figure out an electric tank, we probably solved a lot of the problems on the electric vehicles at large. Great. Should we invest into developing electric mobility? Absolutely. Should we develop energy battery systems? Absolutely. We should innovate around that. If that will ever lead to an electric tank, I don't know, and I don't care. But the investment and the innovation drive around those questions is really important, and it's going to get us ahead. But we also need to then be mature to look at, so where do we actually make a change? Where do we increase mitigation efforts to reduce climate impacts of the military without impacting capabilities? And there, the first priority is probably not the electric tank, but it's going to be on the logistics, it's going to be on the basis and energy saving infrastructure and just not wasting energy. Those are the important parts, right? And finding ways to reduce our emissions within the logistics chain specifically. That is going to make a tremendous impact. And that is not going to degrade capabilities. And also, I think the other part is, as part of this maturity, we need to take the time frame into account. Nobody's asking, like, can you switch tomorrow to fully decarbonize the military? Absolutely impossible. But we need to start the process, the innovation, the research and development to drive that innovation forward. Also, look at the innovation that is coming out of China around a lot of technology. We need that on a defense and security perspective, but we also need that on a competitive perspective as Europe to stay at all technologically in the game.
So if we take that conversation back to where we started at the beginning, Florian, where strategic stability depends on predictability, and I think we all agree now that climate change is systematically eroding that predictability. Are we facing a problem that our current systems, our systems of government, our processes, our frameworks, the way we analyze our foes and what other countries are doing is based on a geopolitical system of where we can predict and where there's signaling and first and second track diplomacy, where maybe in the current environment that doesn't exist, that our frameworks, our systems, our processes are not built for the world that we're living in today?
I think there is a yes and a no in the answer. Is innovation and this drive possible in democracies where the election cycle of 4 or 5 years is dominating a lot of political decisions, whereas other countries will have a decade or few decade long development plan as part of a more autocratic system? I think it's possible, and it has to be possible, because it goes back to that element around a more comprehensive lens of security and democracy and the role of society and the importance of society and the people within a country is fundamentally at the center of everything, and it needs to be. If we think about the green transition in Europe and the policies that we need, now there are real good reasons for concern and relating to what does this change mean. But that doesn't negate that that change is necessary. But we need to find a way in our democratic system to navigate and manage that change, not dictate it, but to manage that change, to take people's grievances around those questions seriously and find solutions that are cooperative. Like, we have a choice, right? We can look at all of this and we can just see that as a competition, and we can see that as an inevitability of conflict. Or we can see this as a fundamental challenge, recognize the challenge, and then come together and solve it. And I think the democratic model and the European model must be at the front of that and is absolutely capable of doing that. Can we evolve it? Absolutely. And we need to, because the world is changing, our models need to adapt. But the fundamental principles within those models and what is the core of security within that, I think is strong and needs to be at the center.
That's really positive. Thank you for that. And then, Florian, the question we always ask guests at the end of the International Risk podcast is, when you look around the world, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
I think we talked about that as also last couple of minutes. I think climate change absolutely is a fundamental thing, and it's of course overshadowed by the dynamics that are happening globally. I mean, there's so many additional things related to climate change and the security implications, implications of the transition that we didn't even touch upon. So it's a fundamental puzzle and a fundamental piece that we need to take further into account. I'm really grateful that you put this topic into your podcast and raise it to a wider audience, which has a wider security lens and a wider risk perspective, right? So I think this is really important.
That's important. Well, thanks very much for raising that. And thank you again, Florian, for coming back on the International Risk podcast.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Well, that was a really insightful conversation with Dr. Florian Krampe. He's a Director of Studies for Peace and Development at SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And this conversation, I think, really reminds us that deterrence depends on physical systems, on infrastructure, and on environmental conditions that right now we can't be taking for granted. Today's podcast was produced and coordinated by Caterina Mazzucchelli. I'm Dominic Bowen. Thanks very much for listening. We will speak again in the next couple of days.